Okay, so remember last lecture we talked about one of the ways Kant tries to set the moral rules, tries to figure out our duties, one of the what he calls the formulations of the categorical imperative, and the formula of universal law. And the formula of universal law, I said, well, for Kant, we are supposed to do our duty, and doing our duty is a matter of following certain moral rules. Well, these formulations of the categorical imperative are supposed to tell us what our duties are, what the rules are. And I said, well, the formula of universal law does a pretty good job telling us what they are. But, with a rules-based theory, we also want to know why the rules are important. And the formula of universal law doesn't seem that it does a great job with that. So this brings us to Kant's formula of humanity, which I think will do a better job on this score. So in this lecture, I want to talk about what the formula of humanity is, and how it approaches these issues, how it will maybe give us a better answer to this second question. So I think before we can talk about the formula of humanity, we need to take a step back. And so look, we think, at least most of us do, that human beings are in some way special. We think that human beings deserve respect in a way that other things don't. You should treat human beings in a certain way. You aren't free to do things to them that you're free to do to just objects or even animals, right? But Kant will say what makes human beings special. Now remember, Kant doesn't want to talk about human nature, so we can't point at some fact about our bodies or any of that, or, that makes us special. Unlike the natural law theory, he doesn't want to make any larger claims about our place in creation, right? Divine command theory, natural law theory might say something like, well, human beings have a certain place in creation, or human beings are created in God's image. Kant doesn't want to talk about any of that, right? He doesn't want to bring that stuff in because he thinks it's very controversial. You might disagree with it if you don't share these religious commitments. Well, so if we're not going to bring that stuff in, what can we say about what makes human beings special? Kant says what makes us special is something we can do, an ability we have. We can act for reasons, and we can decide what are good reasons for us. Well, what does Kant mean by that? Well, I think maybe the easiest way, or at least a good way to get into this, is to think about a story. Let me tell you guys a story. I think this will illustrate what Kant has in mind. Years ago, when I had roommates, one of us had this cat, Mr. Whiskers. Mr. Whiskers was not a good cat. He was a horrible little beast. And so Mr. Whiskers loved to scratch one of our roommates' couch. Just loved to do it. The favorite thing in the world was just to tear up our roommate Steven's couch. And so we decided to, classic idea of negative conditioning. Every time Mr. Whiskers scratches the couch, we're going to spray him in the face with a squirt bottle. Well, this actually didn't do what it was supposed to do because Mr. Whiskers was a stubborn little animal. What happened is not that Mr. Whiskers stopped scratching the couch, but that Mr. Whiskers would sit there on the floor, and you could just see two desires fighting it out in his little kitty brain, right? On the one hand, this desire to scratch the couch. On the other, his desire not to get shot in the face with a squirt bottle. And he'd just sit there, and you could just see them just pushing and pulling in his little cat head, and finally he would go crazy and just start scratching the couch. We'd spray him in the face with the squirt bottle, he'd run behind the TV, the whole thing would start again in a little bit. So what's my point in telling this besides that I think it's funny? My point is Think about when you are considering whether to do something. Or I'll give you a story when I'm thinking of considering doing something, right? My wife is really bad about bringing ice cream and other sweets into the house, and I tell her not to do this because I have no self-control. If there's ice cream in the house, I will eat it for breakfast. But now look, think about what happens, what's going on in my head when I face this choice whether to eat ice cream for breakfast. It's not like Mr. Whiskers. It's not like just two desires are fighting it out in my head. I can step back from my desire for ice cream and ask, is this a good reason to eat ice cream? You know, I think to myself, well, what are the reasons for eating ice cream? What tastes great? What are the reasons for not eating it? Well, none of my clothes fit. It's bad for my health. Do I really want to have so little self-control that I'm the kind of person who does this? I can decide among this set of reasons what are good reasons for me. Is the pleasure I get from eating ice cream, especially ice cream with a bit of coffee, it's great, right? I mean, anyway, I won't talk on and on and make you guys hungry, but I'm kind of making myself want ice cream. But anyway, my point being, it tastes great, it's a lot of pleasure, but is that a good reason for me to eat it? I have all these other reasons not to do it. Think about my health, think about my self-respect. What reasons are better? I can decide what reasons are better, and I can act on those reasons. Contrast that with Mr. Whiskers. Unless cats generally are a lot smarter, a lot more complicated than they seem to me to be, he's not doing any of that, right? He's not sitting there thinking, oh, I want to scratch the couch, that would be a lot of fun, but do I really want to be the kind of kitty who can't control himself when faced with the desire to scratch the couch? Do I want to be the kind of kitty who doesn't respect other people's property rights, right? No. Mr. Whiskers is not thinking any of that. He's just thinking, scratch the couch versus not get shot in the face with a water bottle. That's all that's going on in his tiny kitty head. We as human beings, we can do more than that. We act for reasons, and more importantly, we can step back from our desires, ask ourselves what are good reasons for us to do something and what aren't. Kant says that ability, that's what makes us special. In fact, Kant would say when we talk about humans having free will, that's all we mean. The ability to decide what are and aren't good reasons for us to do something. Animals are just pushed and pulled by whatever desires they have. Human beings aren't. They can step back. They can ask themselves, do those give me good reason to act? And they can choose. That, for Kant, is all that free will is. Well, so why is this important for the formula of humanity? Kant would say, well, look, you as a human being have this ability to act for reasons and choose what are and aren't good reasons. And you think other people should respect your choice. Here's the thing, though. Nothing makes you special. If you think that you deserve a certain kind of respect in virtue of the fact that you have these abilities, while other human beings can do the same thing, you ought to admit they also deserve respect. This brings us to Kant's formula of humanity. For reasons I'll get into, we might more accurately call it the formula of rational nature or rational beings. But when Kant calls it the formula of humanity, we can start there. And so Kant says the formula of humanity says always treat human beings or rational beings, we'll talk in a minute why Kant says human beings, as ends in themselves, never as mere means. And you guys might be asking, well, what is it to treat someone as a mere means? Kant says you treat someone as a mere means when you treat them in a way that fails to respect their ability to act for reasons and decide what are good reasons for them. I think a good way to understand this is to think about cases where we use someone as a means that aren't objectionable, that aren't bad. You guys are currently using me as a means to understand Kant. I am, at least indirectly, using you as a means to a paycheck, right? I use my mailman as a means to get my letters and packages where I want them to go. None of us think any of that is bad. Well, why not? Well, think about my case, right? I was given an offer, beginning of the summer, you teach this class, or beginning of whatever semester, you teach this class, we'll pay you X amount of money. Do you think the offer of X amount of money is a good enough reason to teach this class? You can decide yes or no. If you do think it's a good enough reason, sign on the dotted line, you teach this class. You guys, I'm not using you as a mere means because you knew what the class cost, you knew what you had to do, you made the choice you want to take this class, right? I'm not using the mailman as a mere means because he had a choice as well. I will have to carry people's letters, I'll get X amount of money and benefits for doing this. Is this a good enough reason for me to carry people's letters? Contrast that, none of this is weird, but let's imagine that someone told me, you're going to teach this class or we're going to shoot you. That'd be a weird world, right? But imagine that. So I teach the class. That's using me as a mere means because I don't have a choice. They are forcing me to do what they want. Now, even if for some weird reason, after I teach the class, at gunpoint, they give me some money for it, and even if it's a lot of money, they still treat me as a mere means because they didn't give me a choice. They didn't let me decide, is this a good reason for me or not? Or let's take another case. Let's imagine that you want to buy something off me. Let's say like something on Craigslist, a table. It's on Craigslist. You can decide whether this table is worth your money. Is getting this table a good reason to give me, say, $50? You can decide that. And, if you make me a counteroffer, if you say I'll give you 40 for it, I can decide whether 40 is enough reason to give you my table, right? Contrast that, if you say steal someone's table, right? You haven't given them a choice whether they want to give it to you or not. That is using them as a mere means. You don't respect their ability to decide what are and aren't good reasons for them. Let me give you guys one more example. Think about the lying promise case that we talked about earlier. When you lie to a friend to get money, you are obviously using your friend as a mere means. Your real reason that you want him to act is like, will you give me money? I'm hard up, I need money, would you give me $500? It would really help me out. You don't give him a chance, or you try not to give him a chance if you do this, to decide if helping you out, giving you money is a good enough reason to part with his money. You try to trick him, you give him another reason, and you hope that that works. That uses the person as a mere means. Whenever someone lies to someone, they use them as a mere means because they don't give them the real reason. They try to trick them. They don't let them have the chance to decide, is this a good enough reason to do this? Whenever someone uses force, make somebody do something at gunpoint, or literally, say, twist their arm, that uses them as a mere means because it doesn't give them the choice. It tries to force them to do what the person wants. Doesn't respect this human ability to choose what are and aren't good reasons. All right, so hopefully you guys have a sense of what treating someone as a mere means is and why it's bad. Now, one point, I just want to say a few things. We'll continue. There are a few things I think kind of is, just to pause for a second, they're important to note here. One thing is that for Kant, the formula of rational beings would be more precise. Why do I say this? Well, for Kant, what's important is not that we are biologically human, that we look like we do. What is important for Kant is that we have the ability to be rational. And so for Kant, any being that has this ability to act for reasons and decide what are and aren't good reasons for it would count. Think about, I don't know if you guys have ever watched Star Trek. If you haven't, makes me sad. No, I mean, it actually doesn't. But especially Star Trek The Next Generation has a place near and dear to my heart, but I won't get into that. But in Star Trek, at least Star Trek The Next Generation, there is this intelligent android. He's a robot, but he is as smart, if not smarter than we are, Mr. Data. If we ever create an android that's as smart as Data, then Kant would say it deserves respect too. You couldn't use it as a mere means. Why? Because Mr. Data can act for reasons. Mr. Data can decide what are and aren't good reasons for him. There's actually an episode of Star Trek where, some people want to take Mr. Data apart, see how he works so they can create more androids. Mr. Data doesn't want this to happen. Kant would say it would be wrong to take Data apart against his will. Why? He's a rational being. Taking him apart against his will is using him as a mere means. Same thing goes if we genetically engineer super intelligent, I don't know, pigs or dogs or whatever. They would deserve respect in the same way we do if they can act for reasons and decide what are and aren't good reasons for them. So why in the world does Kant say formula of humanity? Well, I mean, obviously, the only rational beings we are familiar with firsthand are human beings. If when we discover others, they're covered by Kant's formula too. For the time being, he is kind of loose in the way he talks because human beings are the only rational beings that we know of. So one other thing here I want to talk about before we get back to talking about the formula of humanity, explaining it, is just to ask, is Kant too restrictive? Is the formula of humanity too restrictive? What about non-rational beings? They just don't seem to count for Kant. Now look, children don't quite yet have this ability to act for reasons, at least not in the sense that we do. People who are demented, the elderly, advanced stages of Alzheimer's or other dementia, they might not have it. But Kant would say children count. Kant would say the demented count. He would say people who are insane, who can't act for reasons, they count too. Why? Well, children, we don't have to respect them in the same way we do adults, but we have to keep in mind that they will one day become rational. That means that children deserve a certain sort of respect. Now, we don't have to respect children's wishes in the same way we do adults because they're not rational yet, but they deserve a certain kind of respect because one day they will be. The demented and the insane count, why? Well, again, we don't have to respect their wishes in the same way we do adults who mentally function normally, but they deserve a certain kind of respect because they were once rational. Okay, but what about animals? Well, animals don't seem like they count for Kant. Now we can argue maybe some animals are a lot smarter than we think they are. Maybe they're rational beings. Maybe dolphins should count. Maybe some crows should count. I don't know. But a lot of animals clearly aren't rational beings. So Kant's formula of humanity just seems like it doesn't cover them. It would seem that Kant would say we can just do whatever we want to animals. That seems to be a problem, right? Even if you don't think animals deserve the same respect human beings do, we all think it's wrong, or at least hopefully we do, to be cruel to animals for no good reason. The utilitarian would object to Kant here. He would say, or she would say, well, Kant, animals can feel pain, animals can feel pleasure, that counts, it's not just reason. Now, Kant, I think, realizes that leaving animals completely out is a bit creepy, is a bit weird. So what Kant actually says is, well, it's wrong to treat animals badly because that really warps your character. It makes it easier to treat human beings badly. Now Kant seems to have a point there, right? If you watch these horrible documentaries about serial killers, they'll always have a point where these terrible human beings start by killing the neighborhood animals, right? Kant does seem to be right that if you're mean to animals, if you're cruel to animals, it makes it easier to be cruel to people. But I think most of us would say, look, it's bad to be cruel to animals just because they shouldn't be treated in that way, right? If you set a cat on fire, and some horrible people have done this, if you set a cat on fire, that's bad, not because, that'll make it easier for you to do something terrible to people. It might. But even if it doesn't, it's just bad to treat an animal in that way. You shouldn't cause it pain for that, for trivial reasons. Kant can't seem to say that. That seems to be a problem. We'll come back to this when we sum up Kant. I just want to make this clear here. Also, human beings who were never rational and never will be don't seem to count either. Kant really doesn't say much about this, but if you are a human being who is born with severe mental defects and you're not rational and never will be, it seems hard for Kant to say that you should count, that you deserve any kind of respect. Natural law theorists, on the other hand, who will say just in virtue of being a member of the human species, you deserve respect because human life deserves respect, they'll say that this is a problem for Kant. Human beings who are not rational, never will be rational, don't seem to count. Natural law theory will say, well, for their theory, they do and they should. Okay, those are important issues. I just want to get them on the table. We'll leave them aside for now, though, and finish up with the formula of humanity. So one thing I want to note, and I think this is important, is the formula of humanity does a much better job explaining why the moral rules are important. Why shouldn't you treat someone as a mere means? Well, because you think you deserve a certain kind of respect, and nothing makes you special. The other person has the same abilities you do. If you think you deserve respect, you ought to admit that they do as well. Why are the rules important? You, in virtue of being a rational being, think you deserve respect. By consistency, you have to admit other people do too. Well, so we have this formula of humanity, though. How does it relate to the formula of universal law? If we have two different ways of figuring out what our duties are, well, which one are we supposed to use? How do they even tie up with each other? Well, Kant says that the two formulations of the categorical imperative, the two ways of figuring out what our duties are actually just two different ways of putting the same point. Now that might be too strong. Well, at the end of the unit on Kant, we'll see some reason for thinking that might not be true. But I do think the formula of universal law and the formula of humanity are actually pretty closely linked. And they're closely linked because the fact that something fails the formula of universal law often shows how and why it fails the formula of humanity. Let me give you guys a couple of examples. So, in a lot of Europe, you can ride the subway without buying a ticket. You're not supposed to, right? You're supposed to get your ticket, but there aren't turnstiles that keep you from getting on. I'm not sure about everywhere in Europe, but it's this way in Germany, right? And so look, now how they enforce it is every maybe 6th or 7th time you ride the subway, just at random, these guys will get on and check tickets, and if you don't have a ticket, they'll give you a big fine. Here's the thing. If you ride the subway very much in Germany, you figure out what these guys look like. It's always two guys who look like they shouldn't be talking to each other, and one will always have a man purse. Why does he have a man purse? Because that's where the little device that they use to punch in your information and write you the ticket is. If you see those two dudes on a subway platform and you don't have a ticket, you just get off the train, right? I got to the point I could unfailingly spot these guys. I could have rode on the subway without paying if I wanted to. I lived in Frankfurt for a while in Germany. I didn't do this, but I could have. Well, let's imagine I ask myself, do I have a duty to pay for the subway? And I ask myself, well, what would happen if everyone tried to ride the subway without paying? Obviously, I couldn't will that as a universal law. Everyone rides the subway without paying. Why not? Well, because if everybody tried to do that, either there wouldn't be a subway, or the subway in Frankfurt would look like the one in DC, where they have these full body things that, there's a barrier, you can't get on unless you pay, right? Well, so not everyone could do it. But notice something else here, right? The very fact that I can ride the subway without paying depends on all the honest people who do what they're supposed to, who actually do pay for the subway, pay for it to be there. So Kant would say, look, the fact that you couldn't will it as a universal law shows that you are, in a sense, in a very real sense, using all the people who pay for the subway as a mere means. You are freeloading on their paying, you are freeloading on their honesty. It fails the formula of universal law. The fact that it fails the formula of universal law shows how that you are using the honest people who pay as mere means. Or, let's think of another example, right? I think I mentioned this when we were talking about utilitarianism. Let's imagine a student, well, a slightly different example, right? Let's imagine a student who wants to cheat to get a good grade. Could she do that? Could she will that everybody cheat to get the grade they want? No, right? If everybody always cheated, well, there'd be either one or two things would happen, right? Either whenever you took your exam, they would pat you down, take your cell phone, and there'd be a camera watching you take it, or grades just wouldn't mean anything. The fact that she can cheat and that her grade might mean something depends on the fact that there are honest people out there who don't cheat. If everybody cheated and got away with it, grades would be meaningless. Her A that we might say she gets from cheating depends on the fact that most people don't cheat. Well, the fact that she could maybe get away with cheating depends on the fact that most people don't cheat. So, the fact that we couldn't universalize it shows that in a very real sense, by cheating, she would be using all the people who don't cheat as mere means. Fact that it fails the formula of universal law shows how and why it uses others as mere means. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys, right? Or, final one, think of the lying promise. Well, when you lie to somebody to get money, if you do that, that fails the formula of universal law, and clearly by lying you would be using your friend as a mere means. But Kant would say, if you really think about it, you being able to lie to get what you want, that depends on all the honest people who don't lie. So in a very real sense, the formula of universal law shows you how you are using all the honest people who don't lie in the community as mere means as well. You are freeloading on their honesty. When it fails the formula of universal law, you're using other people as mere means in the very real sense that you freeload on their good behavior. So hopefully that makes sense how these two hook together. Okay, so the next few lectures I'm going to talk about just, sizing up Kant's formulas of humanity and universal law, Kant's approach to ethics, but I just want to throw in some final reminders here before we move on. So one thing, remember again, and I'm going to emphasize this over and over, for Kant, it's not your consequences, it's not what happens that matters, but the principles you act on. If you act on a good principle and it has bad consequences, you still have a good will because it's the principle, it's doing your duty that matters. It's not necessarily the consequences. If, on the other hand, you act on a bad principle and it has good consequences, that's still a bad thing. Remember, it is your principles. It's what you choose to do. It's what, principles you choose to act on, whether you do your duty. It's not what happens that matters. Another difference here, another thing that's important to remember, like natural law theory, Kantianism will distinguish doing something very strongly from letting something happen. Think back to the organ cases we talked about, right? It would be perfectly acceptable if you had a liver or kidney and you have to decide who gets it. It would be perfectly acceptable to give it to the younger, healthier person. On the other hand, you couldn't murder an older person to take his liver or kidney to save the younger, healthier person. Why not? Well, remember, natural law theory had its reasons. Well, for Kant, if you just let the person die, if you don't give him the liver you choose to give it, or the kidney you give it to the other person, you're not using him as a mere means. He would have died without the liver, without the kidney. You're not doing anything to him. On the other hand, if you murder him to take his organs, you very much are using him as a mere means. For Kant, that would be wrong. Finally, Kantianism will say you can never use someone as a mere means, no matter what. It is wrong to kill one person, cut him up for his organs, even if you could save 5 people, because you are using him as a mere means. You are using him as a mere means to good consequences, saving 4 lives on balance, but you can't use someone as a mere means in that way, no matter what. Well, when it's 5 people, that seems fine, but Kant would say even if you're using someone as a mere means to save 100, to save 1,000, it's wrong to use them as a mere means. Now, in the next lecture, when we start talking about comparing Kantianism and utilitarianism a little more, I think this will be important. Are we really going to stick with Kant that no matter what, we can't use another person as a mere means? Well, when push comes to shove, maybe it won't be as clear as it initially seems.